This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video provides an overview and summary of Seminar 3, entitled The Psychosis. In this video, I aim to connect dots and provide a more integrated bird's eye view for those who have watched previous videos covering Seminar 3, and for those who have not, provide what I hope will be a helpful entry point into the seminar itself. The final lecture of this seminar provides what amounts to a 3-stage model describing the onset of psychosis, and I'll use this model to structure the major ideas covered in this video. Before developing stage 1, some preliminary comments are in order. The use of the term psychosis in this seminar is not how psychologists use this term, despite some notable overlap. First, paranoid delusions are the exemplary case of psychosis rather than something like schizophrenia. Lacan places much less emphasis on hallucinations, seeing them as derivative of a more fundamental issue. Additionally, Lacan is not tremendously interested in the content of delusions. He's not concerned with trying to decode the true meaning of such tightly held beliefs as if they contain the secret to the subject's difficulties. In fact, Lacan is not very interested in symptoms at all, considering them to be surface phenomena that miss the deeper structural issues at play. Second, those deeper structures are not concerned with biology. Even though Lacan acknowledges that biology plays a role in the psychotic subject's structural vulnerabilities, nonetheless, biology is wholly insufficient for a clinical understanding of psychosis. Third, those deeper structures entail the subject's relationship to language, and this linguistic dimension of psychosis has been woefully neglected by most theorists. We've learned from the previous 2 seminars that the subject's relation to the world is mediated by language, which consists of a comprehensive system of rule-governed signifiers called the symbolic order that, when internalized by a subject, usually comes to be attached to meanings or what is called signifieds. This is not to say that our only relationship to reality is limited to language, but according to Lacan, language inevitably structures our animal contact with reality such that the world we encounter always amounts to a human world, that is, a cultured world. The rules governing this language are not merely rules of grammar, but more broadly, these rules permit and prohibit what can and cannot be put into explicit discourse, and so what can become recognized by the subject. Those rules of language, Lacan claims, are always embodied in a highly particular manner for each subject in what he names the big other. The big other is the unique source of authority that both watches over subjects, encouraging them to aspire to fulfilling these rules, as with the ego ideal, and functioning as a ferocious figure that imposes a version of these rules in a particularly harsh manner, the superego. Usually the big other is first embodied by one's parents, and if internalized, will continue on in the background of all our ongoing and future relationships, being the one we unconsciously address when we speak to those whom we are directly communicating with, the little others. With this basic framework in place, let's discuss stage 1. An imaginary dissolution and encountering a signifier in the real. To understand what it means to encounter a signifier in the real requires an appreciation of the primordial signifier itself and how it typically functions for the subject. In this seminar, Lacan provides several metaphors that helps us in this regard. First is the metaphor of bumper cars. If you've ever ridden in a bumper car at an amusement park, you might be familiar with the experience in which a bunch of cars crash into one another, leading to everyone being stuck in one place. You may also recall how you try to avoid this by obeying an unspoken rule that states that once you bump into another car, you back off rather than continue to drive the vehicle into them, knowing that some degree of separation is necessary to continue enjoying the ride and not spend the rest of the time just all jammed up Imaginary relations are like these bumper cars hitting one another, and the primordial signifier is like that unspoken rule that regulates the cars so that they can move in an orderly fashion without getting jammed up. Second is the metaphor of the stool. Ordinarily, a stool is well balanced on its legs, but if one of the legs breaks, the stool becomes highly unstable and is likely to fall over with even the slightest disturbance. Similarly, when a fundamental or primordial signifier goes missing, the imaginary configuration of our lives that makes things meaningful is easily undone, which is what is meant by an imaginary dissolution. This is why a particular event for a psychotic can trigger the onset of psychosis, even when such an event seems rather benign for most of us. The meanings by which we live our lives are only tenuously held when the primordial signifier is not present. Third, and most famously, is the quilting point. In the physical act of quilting fabric, one stitches together various designs that all connect around a central point that keeps the fabric together in a cohesive manner. I know next to nothing about quilting, but what I understand is that without this point, the thread that composes the various designs will begin to come apart. Here, the threads represent the stitching together of signifiers and signifieds such that there is some relative consistency between, for example, the words I use and the meanings attributed to those words, meanings that can be approximately shared with others in a manner that allows for some degree of successful communication. The quilting point then is a signifier that allows for some systematic binding between signifiers and signifieds. Fourth is the metaphor of the highway. The highway provides a clear path between two distances that makes it possible to easily drive between them. Around the highway then emerges various towns and other sites, perhaps worthy of a pit stop as one travels to their final destination. Without a major highway, we would have to take a bunch of minor roads. And if you've ever had to travel to some location far away from a major highway, you might appreciate how confusing and easily lost you can become. Here, the highway is like the primordial signifier that structures how we navigate through life. And the emergence of sites and towns along the way are like signifieds or centers of meaning. Furthermore, we're not dealing with a set of pre-given meanings that we are somehow linking up to signifiers, but that the meanings themselves can be manufactured by the signifier itself. This is very different from how we usually think of language, which tends to prioritize meaning over the specific configuration of physical sounds and markings used to communicate those meanings. We often think of signifiers as tools that function on behalf of meanings that are attached to them. So rather than say the cat is on the mat, I could say that the cray is on the fratch. And so long as I consistently use the signifier cray and fratch in a way to convey a consistent meaning, then that's all the signifier does. But Lacan argues that signifiers themselves carry their own history. They are not simply fungible tools for communicating meanings, but the history of these signifiers themselves in relation to other signifiers contains repeating structures that serve to produce, repeat, and manufacture meanings. This is in fact how transference works. A signifier from the past emerges again in the present, and this allows for a transfer of meanings from situation A over to situation B in such a way that I now treat the later signifier as if it has the same meaning as that which was attached to the signifier when it was deployed in childhood. Now, ordinarily, there is some order to the meanings associated with signifiers, and this is because there is already internalized a primordial signifier. The primordial signifier then has to do with something far more basic to our experience of reality than most other signifiers. Another similar signifier is around identity and allows me to ask the question, who am I? Now, the fact that I even asked the question, if only on an unconscious level, is indicative of having internalized a signifier for existence and identity that allows such questions to be asked in the first place. Now, Lacan places significant emphasis on the paternal signifier. The name of the Father is a signifier that concerns how I am placed relative to the authority of the symbolic order itself. An internalized signifier for authority is important to Lacan because it seems he believes that all other signifiers are dictated by the rules or laws established through this paternal name. So, to take a Wittgensteinian example, if I do not know the rules of a game, I can't play. Or rather, I might make up my own rules in a manner that no one else is capable of playing with me. The rules of the game dictate all the possible moves I can make and the meanings that get attached to them. So now we can have a clearer understanding of stage 1. In psychosis, this fundamental signifier is rejected, which does not mean consciously rejected, but rather that at some basic level, it's not affirmed and not internalized by the subject. But this doesn't mean that the primordial signifier completely goes away. In fact, it would seem that the signifier becomes even more present as its basic materiality finds expression as a real voice, a real commandment arriving from the real. To go back to our game metaphor, if the game is ordinarily played with an implicit understanding of the rules, it's now as if the rules themselves have become one of the players who does its own thing independent of the other players. The consequence of this is that the other players cannot really play the game. They just continuously make up their own rules, and those rules themselves radically shift throughout. There's nothing stabilizing the gameplay. And this is what is meant by the imaginary dissolution. Stage 2 entails the decomposition of discourse. This stage necessitates an appreciation of speech, communication, and the nature of the unconscious as the discourse of the big other. Lacan typically portrays the unconscious as a kind of conversation that goes on between that signifier of the internalized authority and that signifier which is refused recognition and so is not allowed to enter explicit speech. It's that aspect of the subject that becomes a question to itself. And it's the insistence of this question that constitutes the subject's response to the authoritative speech of the big other. The big other says, "That's what you are," and the subject responds, "Am I? What does it mean to be that?" Of course, we have to be cautious not to think of such a question as if one might ask it consciously. It's the nature of such a question that it typically does not get expressed in speech, but instead, if it is to be noticed at all, it is in the form of a reformulation now as a symptom. So we might think of the symptom as a signifier that represents the fundamental question that we cannot explicitly ask, which concerns ourselves as subjects. A decomposition of this discourse in psychosis would then involve the symbolic exchange no longer happening at the level of the symbolic, but instead taking place within a set of imaginary relations that are apprehended to take place outside the subject altogether. This externalized, decomposed discourse need not be a literal auditory hallucination, but rather it might be, as in the case of paranoid delusions, an imaginary exchange between different figures conspiring against the subject. The discourse is thus shifted to take place between a radically alienated ego and a radical alterity of the big other, both of whom are encountered in the form of the little other. And whereas in neurosis, the exchange between unconscious subject and big other is reformulated through symbolic substitutions by way of metaphor, the exteriorized exchange among little others takes place by various, almost metonymic displacements that lead the subject down all sorts of unexpected paths, connected only by the relative proximity of the signifiers, much like how conspiracy theories are strung together from a set of coinciding facts, and where the little fact takes on the greatest significance for this conspiracy theorist. That last example brings us to stage 3, the imaginary reconstruction. As has already been stated, signifiers and signifieds are ordinarily bound together by quilting points, the most fundamental of which is the paternal signifier. Ordinarily, we're not thinking about signifiers, however, but instead are concentrated upon signifieds, that is, the meanings that things have for us. We're constantly trying to preserve and impose a meaning on life that helps us make sense of it. In fact, we often end up in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis because our signifieds are no longer doing the job of adequately covering over the gaps left by the activity of the symbolic. Now, in the case of psychosis, the dissolution of the imaginary world, the meaningful world, and the decomposition of the symbolic exchange between unconscious subject and big other forces the subject to come to terms with the severe state of alienation that they are in the grips of. But without the guiding influence of the paternal signifier to structure and determine the set of meanings available to the subject draws together meanings in a metonymic style that haphazardly makes connections that often make little sense to others. Lacan provides the example of seeing a red car in the street, which begins to take on a surprising degree of importance for the subject. Rather than its red color being situated within a set of differentiated signifiers, such as other color names, red instead comes to acquire an extraordinary meaning for the subject, perhaps communicating the car's pernicious intent, since red is readily associated with anger and hostility. Nonetheless, this hodgepodge of meanings comes to be organized in a manner that, to some degree, restabilizes the psychotic's world in a manner similar to how conspiracy theories are formulated. Though, of course, not all conspiracy theorists are themselves structured in a psychotic manner, but there is, as Lacan indicates, at least a little bit of the psychotic in all of us. Also, because there is no internalized primordial signifier, there's not the kind of doubt that would ordinarily emerge and that would create some space from one's ego to allow for a questioning of these meanings. These questions are not asked on the unconscious level in the usual manner, and so once the subject arrives at a set of meanings, they acquire a rigid certainty. I know who I am, and I know what the other wants. And this gives rise to the well-formed delusion. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. And you can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. And so this concludes Seminar 3. We'll next move into Seminar 4, and in that seminar we'll address the concept of the object and object relations from Lacan's perspective. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.